The whistle of the train faded slowly into the distance. Claire stood alone on the weathered wooden platform. She was 26 years old, and the suitcase she carried weighed far less than the guilt she was hauling with it. The wind blew hot across that late summer afternoon in the Texas hill country. It kicked up clouds of dry dust around her boots. There were no maps in her mind and no clear destination. She only had one certainty. She could not look back. The sound of the rails ticking as they cooled was her only company. The depot was empty, and the sun had already begun sinking toward the hills. Then a steady creaking broke the heavy silence. An old wagon pulled by two dark horses rolled slowly into view. The wooden wheels groaned against the dirt road. The man holding the reins looked as though he'd been carved from the same dry earth the horses walked on. He was about 40 years old, and his face carried the deep lines of a hard, solitary life. He pulled the horses up short when he saw the young woman standing alone by the tracks. "Ain't another train through here till next week," he said, his voice low and rough. Claire tightened her grip on her suitcase. Cold sweat gathered in her palms. She had no money for a ticket back to the city, and she had no intention of returning to the life she'd just run from anyway. Her voice shaking, she asked if he knew of anywhere nearby, somewhere that might trade a roof and a meal for a day's work. The man studied her with tired, dark eyes. He took in her thin frame, standing in the middle of nowhere. Finally, he gave a short, decisive nod. "Get in," he said flatly. No name, no questions. The wagon ride was long and completely silent. The land changed slowly from dry, flat land to green pasture and low, lonesome hills. Claire felt every rut in the road jolt through the old wood beneath her, but the discomfort was almost a relief. For the first time in months, her mind wasn't flooded with the sound of her own past screaming at her. The steady rocking of the wagon kept her from thinking too hard about everything she'd lost. They arrived at a huge farm, clearly once grand, now visibly neglected. Tall trees blocked out most of the moonlight. The farmhouse had peeling paint and a wide front porch drowning in shadow. He climbed down and began unhitching the tired horses. He waved for her to follow him inside. The house smelled like old wood, cold coffee, and a deep-settled loneliness. He showed her to a small room at the end of the back hallway. "Breakfast's at first light," was all he said before turning away. He left her alone in a room lit by a single small candle. Claire slept that first night on a hard, cold mattress. She listened to the unfamiliar sounds of open country and the wind knocking against the windows. The next day, the hard reality of farm work hit her hands without mercy. The man, whom the few neighbors called Jack, worked from sunup to sundown. She had to muck out dark stalls and feed a noisy flock of chickens. She hauled heavy buckets of water from a distant well to the kitchen. By the end of her first week, her palms were covered in painful blisters. Every movement reminded her she wasn't in the city anymore. But she never complained, not once. That constant physical ache was a welcome distraction from the storm inside her. Sometimes hard work really is the only medicine for a wounded heart. Jack kept an almost religious distance from his new hired hand. They ate together every day at the same big oak table, but they rarely exchanged a word that wasn't about the chores. He carried a grief on his shoulders that seemed to fill every corner of that old house. There were nail holes in the hallway walls, where framed photographs must have once hung. Claire understood quickly that nobody asked uncomfortable questions here. That silent agreement was exactly what she needed to start breathing again. No one judged her, and no one demanded explanations she wasn't ready to give. Slowly, that hard routine began weaving an invisible thread between them. Jack started leaving a small jar of homemade salve on the table meant for the raw blisters on Claire's hands. He never said a word about it. He'd just set the little glass jar beside the bread before heading out to the fields. It was a rough, wordless kind of care. Claire, in turn, noticed a huge tear in his favorite work jacket, a hole in the left sleeve that let the cold wind straight through. One night, while he slept, she took a needle and heavy thread and sat by the wood stove to mend it carefully. The next morning, Jack picked up his jacket before heading out the door and paused, noticing the neat stitches on the repaired sleeve. He looked toward the kitchen where Claire was quietly making coffee. He gave a small nod of thanks and walked out to face the morning. Those small, quiet kindnesses slowly began melting the ice around the farm. But the past always finds a crack to slip back through. It happened on an afternoon of pouring rain, the kind that changed everything. The rain fell so hard there was no working the fields. Claire was digging through the back hallway looking for dry blankets. That part of the house always stayed dark, cold, and firmly shut. Jack had told her there was nothing useful on that side of the property. Trying to force open a stuck cabinet, she lost her balance for a second. Her shoulder knocked the door of the last room in the hallway. The wood gave with a soft crack, and the door swung wide open. Claire froze in the doorway, unable to look away from what she saw inside. The room wasn't an abandoned storage space full of dust like she'd imagined. It was kept perfectly clean, like a private, aching little shrine. A child's small clothes were folded neatly on an iron bed. Hand-carved wooden toys sat lined up on a round rug. The whole room smelled like beeswax and dried grass. Claire stepped inside, transfixed by the quiet, sorrowful scene. The sadness in that room was so thick she could almost touch it. Suddenly, a large hand grabbed her arm firm and shaking. It was Jack. His knuckles were white with how hard he gripped. His dark eyes carried a mix of blind fury and unbearable pain. Thunder rolled across the tin roof of the old house. Claire held her breath, bracing for the man's anger to explode. But the fury she expected never came. Instead, the darkness drained from Jack's eyes all at once. The big, strong man seemed to collapse from the inside out. His rough fingers released her arm slowly, almost painfully. His knees buckled under the weight of a grief he'd carried alone for far too many years. He dropped hard onto the small woven rug. The sound that came out of him wasn't a shout. It was a low, choked-off moan, the sound of a wounded animal finally giving up the fight. Claire stepped back, startled by the sheer weight of that raw grief. The rain kept hammering the windows outside. The cold room full of neatly folded children's clothes seemed to shrink around them. She looked at his weathered face now buried in his big, dirt-stained hands. Every wall she'd built up crumbled in that instant. The simple human instinct to comfort another broken soul overpowered whatever fear she had left. Claire knelt slowly on the floor beside him. She said nothing, because there were no words for that kind of grief. She simply reached out and rested her small, pale hand on his shoulder on the old flannel shirt he always wore. The fabric was cold and damp with sweat and tension. Jack flinched at the unexpected, gentle touch. He lifted his tear-streaked face. Their eyes met in the middle of that small shrine to loss. "That was my son," he whispered, his voice so broken it barely sounded human. The words came out slow, like each syllable was cut from broken glass. Claire tightened her hand gently on his shoulder. "He was barely 5. Jack went on, staring into nothing. The winter came in harder than usual that year. A fever that wouldn't break. Roads blocked with snow. A doctor who got there too late. Claire listened, feeling her chest tighten with every word. She understood now why the house always sat in that heavy, sunken silence. This farm wasn't just a home. It was a monument to a father's guilt. "My wife couldn't take it," he added, his head dropping in shame. "She packed a bag one morning and walked to the depot without looking back." That last sentence landed painfully close to Claire's own hidden story. Both of them carried the scar of a desperate escape down a set of railroad tracks. Jack had been left behind by someone running from unbearable loss. Claire was running to keep her own past from destroying her completely. That night, the storm outside finally began to calm. Inside that forbidden room, Another kind of storm had also found its end. Jack and Claire sat on the floor for hours, worn down together. When the first pale light of dawn touched the window, they stood in silence. Jack closed the door to the room gently, but this time he didn't lock it. Something had broken, and at the same time something new had been built. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on the farm shifted quietly but unmistakably. Mornings no longer started with that cold, calculated distance between them. Jack started pouring her coffee before she even asked, remembering exactly how she liked it. Claire began wearing an old, oversized work shirt he'd given her. Worn at the cuffs, it kept out the morning cold far better than her own thin coat ever had. It was a borrowed shield that smelled like clean dirt, oak wood, and him. The glances they traded over breakfast now carried a different kind of warmth. They no longer avoided eye contact out of fear of crossing some invisible line. They watched each other with the careful curiosity of two survivors sharing the same island. One clear afternoon, while mending the fence around the sheep pen together, their hands brushed. Jack was passing her a rusted iron hammer, and his rough fingers grazed her pale skin. A quiet current ran through both of them under the hot sun. Neither pulled away right away, letting the touch last a second longer than it needed to. Jack looked up, and his dark eyes found hers. There was a silent, frightened question hanging in the warm afternoon air. Claire felt her cheeks flush in a way she'd almost forgotten. For the past year, her instinct had been to push away any kind of closeness. But Jack's steady, grounded presence gave her a sense of safety she hadn't expected. "You've got dirt on your cheek," he murmured, his voice rough enough to make her chest ache. He raised his free hand, and with surprising gentleness for a man his size, wiped the smudge away. His rough thumb traced her cheekbone, leaving a trail of warmth behind. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, giving in to the simple human need to be touched with tenderness. For a moment, time seemed to stop completely in that quiet field. They were on the verge of crossing a line that would change everything between them. Then the sharp blare of a car horn shattered the moment. They both spun toward the long dirt road leading up to the property. A thick cloud of dust rose behind a dark, modern car. Nobody ever visited Jack's farm, and certainly not in a car that clearly came from the city. Claire's stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. All the color drained from her face in an instant. The car stopped hard in front of the main fence, engine cutting off with a metallic growl. The driver's door opened, and a man in a wrinkled black suit stepped out into the dust. He wore dark sunglasses that hid his eyes, and he carried a folded white paper in his hand. Claire instinctively stepped back, half hiding behind Jack's broad frame. Jack noticed immediately the pure terror radiating off her. He squared his shoulders and walked forward, positioning himself like a wall between her and the stranger. The man in black stopped at the fence, brushing dust from his jacket. He unfolded the paper slowly and looked Jack up and down with open contempt. "I'm looking for a young woman," the stranger said, his voice flat and cold. He read from the paper without asking permission. "Pale skin, dark straight hair, a little over 5 feet tall." The description was an exact, dangerous match for the woman hiding behind the farmer. Jack clenched his jaw so hard the muscles stood out along his weathered face. He didn't look away from the man's hidden eyes for even a second. The quiet peace they'd built over the past weeks had just been shattered. Jack didn't blink as he stared into the stranger's sunglasses. Hot wind kicked up small whirlwinds of dust against the old fence boards. Claire crouched behind Jack's massive frame, trying to make her breathing completely silent. The man in black waited for an answer, his posture rigid with city arrogance. Jack spat off to the side of the road before crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Been living alone here 5 years." Jack lied, his voice cold and steady enough to freeze blood. "My wife left, and nobody's come down this road looking for anything since." The lie came off his tongue so naturally it even surprised Claire hidden behind him. The stranger studied the farmer's weathered face for several long, heavy seconds. He seemed to be searching for a flicker of doubt, some small tremor in the tight jaw or the dark stare. But Jack was a master at hiding pain and secrets behind a wall of silence. Finally, the man in the suit nodded slowly and refolded the paper with mechanical precision. He turned without a word of thanks and climbed back into his modern black car. The engine roared, breaking the quiet of the countryside, and the vehicle backed away slowly down the narrow road. Jack didn't move from his spot until the dust cloud had drifted a few hundred yards off. Only then did he drop his arms and let out the breath he'd been holding. He turned slowly to Claire, still crouched on the ground, her face pale as paper. He offered her a large, rough hand to help her up from the dirt. She took it with trembling fingers, her legs barely able to hold her own weight. "We need to get inside, now," he ordered in a hoarse, urgent whisper. They walked toward the front porch, glancing constantly over their shoulders. The sound of their footsteps on the wooden boards seemed deafening in that sudden silence. They stepped into the dark kitchen, and Jack shut the heavy door, sliding the old iron bolt into place with a sharp click. Jack moved quickly to the windows in the main room and pulled the thick wooden shutters closed. The house sank into a heavy, suffocating darkness, lit only by thin lines of light slipping through the cracks. The afternoon heat began building up inside the now sealed, unventilated rooms. "He hasn't left," Jack said flatly, peering through a small gap in the weathered wood. Claire crept closer and looked over his shoulder. In the distance near the hills, marking the edge of the property, the dark car sat parked under a big shade tree. The man in the suit had decided to camp nearby and watch the farm's every move. The trap had closed around them without a sound. They were trapped inside the old house, prisoners of a lie that was keeping them alive. Claire felt a wave of crushing guilt press down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She had brought her own darkness into a place that had barely begun healing from its own tragedy. She looked at Jack, bracing for blame or regret in his eyes for having covered for her. But the farmer only met her gaze with fierce, absolute determination. "Nobody's taking you out of this house unless you want to go," he told her with a firmness that left no room for argument. Those words landed like a heavy anchor thrown into the churning ocean of Claire's mind. Over the next 3 days, life on the farm turned into a quiet, tense kind of captivity. They couldn't light lamps at night without risking notice. They couldn't go out to hang laundry or feed the animals with any of their old freedom. Jack slipped out the back door before dawn, staying low through the tall grass. He'd handle what needed doing in the barn and get back before the sun fully rose. Claire sat in the dark kitchen counting the minutes, praying he'd make it back safe. The forced confinement began blurring the line between fear and a desperate need for human contact. They spent hours sitting on the floor of the hallway, the one part of the house without windows to the outside. The summer heat forced them to share what little cool air gathered near the old wood floor. In that oppressive darkness, whispers became their only safe way to talk. Claire told him about a huge city that had suffocated her, about forced signatures on documents, about debts that were never really hers. She spoke in broken, scattered pieces, sketching the outline of a gilded cage she'd fled on that train. Jack listened to every word without a single trace of judgment. Sometimes, when her voice threatened to break under the weight of tears, he'd simply reach through the darkness. His rough fingers would find hers holding on, with a gentle strength that reminded her she wasn't alone. That constant physical closeness in the middle of real danger acted like an emotional accelerant for both of them. The tension from outside seemed to translate into a kind of static electricity between their bodies. Every accidental brush passing a glass of water sent a shiver that had nothing to do with fear. One especially hot night, the sound of cicadas outside was steady and endless. Claire sat with her back against the hallway wall, knees pulled to her chest. Jack sat close beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his skin. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess," she murmured, turning her head toward his dark outline. "You had a quiet life here in spite of everything, and I wrecked it in an instant." A silent tear slid down her cheek and landed on the fabric of the old pants she wore. Jack shifted slowly, closing the small distance left between them on the floor. His big, calloused hand rose to her face, wiping the tear away with his thumb. The touch was slow, deliberate, full of a tenderness that clashed sharply with his rough exterior. "My life before you got here wasn't peace, Claire," he whispered, his voice rough against her ear. "It was just a big, empty grave where I was waiting for my own end every single day." His warm breath brushed against her neck, making her heart pound out of control. In the thick darkness of that hallway, their faces found each other, guided by something urgent and instinctive. Jack's dry lips brushed against hers, hesitant at first, then with an overwhelming need. The kiss was deep, desperate, tasting of fear, of confinement, and of a fragile, redemptive hope. She tangled her trembling fingers in his thick hair, pulling him closer against her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his broad chest, as if he wanted to shield her inside himself. In that tight, urgent embrace, the outside world and all its threats stopped existing for a few endless minutes. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was a love forged in survival and cold sweat. But reality has a brutal way of knocking on the door when you let your guard down. By dawn on the 4th day of confinement, the fresh food inside the house had run out completely. Only a few old canned goods and some stale flour remained in the dark pantry. Jack knew the animals in the barn also needed attention he hadn't been able to give them. The small indoor water tank was running dangerously low because of the extreme heat. Someone had to go out in broad daylight down to the tool cellar for basic supplies. "I'll go," Jack said, tightening the laces on his worn boots with quick, decisive movements. "That car hasn't moved from the hill since last night. He might be asleep this time of day." Claire looked at him wide-eyed, silently begging him not to cross that threshold. "It's too dangerous to go out now," she whispered, grabbing the sleeve of his old flannel shirt. "We can hold out with boiled water and canned goods one more day until he gets tired and leaves." But Jack shook his head stubbornly, knowing the situation couldn't hold much longer. "I'll be back in 5 minutes flat," he promised, pressing a quick, firm kiss to Claire's pale forehead. "Stay away from the windows, and don't open this door for anything until you hear my voice." She nodded slowly, letting go of his shirt with a painful reluctance and a heavy sense of dread. Jack pulled back the heavy iron bolt and opened the back door just wide enough to slip through. The bright morning light cut into the dark kitchen like a knife, blinding Claire for a second. He slid outside, and the door closed softly behind him with a final, quiet click. Claire was left completely alone in the total silence of the old creaking house. She counted the seconds in her head, pacing small circles around the big oak table. Her hands were cold with sweat, and her chest ached with the tension of the last few days. She reached 60 seconds, then 120. Time seemed to stretch like thick rubber about to snap. She crept toward the kitchen window and peered through a small crack in the shutter. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dry dust of the empty backyard. There was no sign of Jack anywhere, and no sound coming from the old tool cellar either. Suddenly, a strange metallic sound broke the tomb-like silence of the house. It didn't come from the backyard, or the side windows she'd been watching so anxiously. The sound came clearly from the front door at the far end of the long, dark hallway. Claire froze completely, feeling a bucket of ice water pour straight down her hunched back. Someone was working a metal tool into the old front door lock with clumsy, deliberate movements. The creak of old wood suggested they were trying to force the door open from outside. She backed away toward the deep shadows of the kitchen, heart hammering wildly in her throat. Jack had told her not to open the door for anyone. But he was outside, and this was happening from within the house's own perimeter. The brass doorknob on the front door turned slowly downward with a sharp, terrifying creak. Claire held her breath in the darkness of the kitchen, feeling her heart slam against her ribs. The groan of the old wood meant the man in the suit was one push away from getting inside. But before the door could give way completely, a deafening crash shook the whole front porch. It wasn't the sound of wood breaking. It was the brutal impact of a heavy body hitting the porch boards outside. The doorknob snapped back to its original position, and a strangled shout tore through the morning quiet. Claire stepped forward confused and shaking from head to toe. The sounds that followed froze her completely in the middle of the dark hallway. They were dry, heavy, wet sounds, carrying a raw violence that chilled the blood of anyone listening. Jack hadn't been in the tool cellar like she'd first imagined. The farmer had spotted the man approaching the house and intercepted him from behind just in time. A desperate ambush had turned into a fight to the death on the dusty front steps. The sound of flesh being struck against wood echoed like a grim, hollow echo through the thin walls of the house. Claire heard a deep, furious growl she recognized instantly. It was Jack's voice, but stripped of all its humanity, turned into the roar of a cornered animal. The man in the suit tried to fight back and spat out an insult thick with hatred and pain. Glass shattered somewhere as one of the empty porch planters crashed to the ground. Then Jack's blows grew faster, heavier, and completely merciless. Claire understood with horror exactly what was happening on the other side of that oak door. The fear of losing her, combined with adrenaline and his own buried trauma, had shattered whatever control the farmer had left. Jack was losing himself completely, and he wasn't going to stop until he'd killed the intruder with his bare hands. A choking, gurgling breath reached her from outside. The stranger was losing consciousness under the dirt-stained fists of the farmer. Claire knew that if she didn't step in that very instant, the man who had given her shelter would become a killer. That blood would stain Jack's noble, wounded soul forever. He'd go to prison for the rest of his life, losing his farm, his freedom, and any chance he had left at happiness. All because of a dark past that wasn't even his, but hers. Claire ran for the front door with a strength she didn't know her fragile body had. Her trembling fingers grabbed the old iron bolt and yanked it back with pure desperation. The metal shrieked, loudly protesting the sudden rough movement. She threw the heavy wooden door wide open, letting blinding sunlight flood the dark hallway. The hot morning air hit her face, carrying a heavy smell of stirred-up dust and fresh blood. What she saw on the porch floor stole her breath for a long, terrible second. The man in the black suit lay flat on his back across the splintered wood boards. His face was an unrecognizable mess of bruises, and his expensive dark suit was caked in yellow dust. Jack straddled the stranger's chest, fists raised in the air for one final blow. The farmer's knuckles were skinned raw and shining bright red. His dark eyes were blown wide, blind with fury and the desperate need to protect what he now considered his. He was one strike away from bringing the full weight of his body down on the defenseless man's skull. "Jack, stop!" Claire screamed, her voice breaking with terror and anguish. The sound of his own name seemed to slam against the invisible wall of fury surrounding Jack's mind. His broad shoulders tensed in midair, but his bloodied fists didn't drop right away. She didn't think twice and ran out of the relative safety of the hallway. She dropped to her knees on the rough boards right beside the two men caught in that brutal struggle. Splinters dug into her legs through the thin fabric of her worn dress. Claire grabbed Jack's right arm with both hands, throwing her whole weight into pulling him backward. His skin burned hot, slick with cold sweat and loose dirt from the road. "Look at me, please," she begged, crying openly, pressing her fingers hard into the tense muscles of his arm. The physical contact and her broken voice hit Jack's lost sanity like a bucket of ice water. He blinked several times, as though waking from a deep, dark nightmare. He lowered his arms slowly, breathing hard, chest heaving like a broken bellows. He looked down at his own blood-stained hands with pure horror and revulsion. Then he looked down at the beaten face of the man in the black suit, who barely breathed under his weight. Finally, he turned his stiff neck and found Claire's tear-filled, terrified eyes. There are no words to describe the deep shame a good man feels when he comes face to face with his own capacity for destruction. Jack pushed himself off the ground, stumbling backward, moving away from the motionless body like it was on fire. He leaned against one of the wooden porch columns and shut his eyes tight. Claire stayed on her knees beside the stranger, checking the pulse at his bruised neck with shaking fingers. "He's alive," she confirmed in a whisper barely audible over the hot midday wind. "He's breathing, but we need to hide him before someone comes down the main road and sees this." Claire's mind was racing now, driven by a pure instinct for shared survival. Jack nodded, silently wiping the sweat from his brow with a dirt-streaked forearm. Together, they dragged the investigator's heavy body across the dry, dusty backyard. The effort made Claire's muscles burn with pain, but she didn't let go of the heavy weight of that dark suit, not for a single second. They hauled him to the old horse barn, the most distant and quiet spot on the whole property. They tied him firmly to a wooden post, using thick baling twine and old, worn leather straps. The man in the suit stayed completely unconscious, his head hanging forward against his stained chest. The dim barn smelled of dry hay, old leather, and the fresh fear both of them still carried in their bodies. Jack sank down onto a bale of hay, elbows on his knees, hiding his face in his bloodied hands. The silence between them was far heavier than the confinement of the last few days had ever been. Claire walked to the old stone water trough and soaked a clean rag in the cold water pooled at the bottom. She approached the farmer slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might strike out in surprise. She knelt in front of him, repeating that same scene from the night of the storm in the forbidden room, but now under far darker circumstances. She took Jack's huge, injured hands in hers with extreme, reverent gentleness. She began cleaning the dried blood and dirt from his skinned knuckles with the damp cloth. Every movement of her fingers was a silent caress, a quiet absolution for the sin he'd nearly committed for her sake. He looked up slowly, and his dark eyes carried a torment that split the young woman's heart in two. "I almost killed him," the farmer whispered, his voice raw and choked with self-disgust. "I wanted to kill him for daring to come looking for you, for trying to tear you away from me forever." Claire stopped moving the damp cloth and pressed his battered hands against her own racing chest. "But you didn't," she answered, with an absolute firmness that left no room for doubt or blame. "You stopped when I asked you to, and now we're in this together all the way to the end." The bond between them had just been sealed with something far heavier than attraction or shared loneliness. Now they were partners in the shadows, bound together by an act of violence born out of love and desperation. Sharing a dark secret is often the strongest and most dangerous glue that can bind two lost souls together. A couple of tense, sweltering hours passed in the heat trapped inside the old barn. Finally, a low groan broke the steady drone of flies buzzing around the horses. The man in the black suit began stirring weakly against the tight ropes holding him to the post. Jack stood up immediately, squaring back into a rigid, imposing stance in front of the tied prisoner. Claire stayed behind him, but this time she wasn't hiding. She was standing, united and completely resolved. The investigator opened one swollen, bruised eye, spitting a thick line of blood onto the dry hay. "Who sent you, and how much do you actually know about me?" Claire demanded, her voice cold enough to surprise even her own companion. She wasn't the frightened, fragile young woman who'd stepped off that train weeks ago anymore. The instinct to protect her new life and the man she loved had given her a completely new and fierce strength. The stranger let out a dry laugh that quickly turned into a rough, painful cough. "I'm not a cop," the man said, dragging his words through a split lip and a badly beaten jaw. "I'm just a private investigator hired by someone with a lot of money and very little patience for romantic getaways." Claire felt an icy chill run down her spine without mercy. She knew exactly who that battered, bound man was talking about. It was the powerful man she'd escaped, the ruthless creditor demanding a debt she could never possibly pay. "I wired my client yesterday morning from the next town over," the investigator continued with a grim, bloody smile. "Told him I'd found you hiding out at this miserable little farm in the middle of nowhere. The defeated man's tone carried a poisonous threat that hung heavy in the stale barn air. Jack clenched his injured fists again, but Claire touched his arm gently to keep him from losing control a second time. "Then why did you come to the house alone today, if you'd already told your boss exactly where I was?" she asked, working quickly through the situation. The man in the suit coughed again and looked at the pair with a sick gleam in his one open eye. "Came to make sure you didn't slip out the back before the cavalry showed up." He took a deep breath and dropped the last piece of the puzzle squarely on both their heads. "My boss isn't sitting around waiting for news back at his office in the city," the prisoner said, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "He drove all night, straight through, down every back road in this godforsaken part of the state." Claire and Jack traded a look of pure, silent panic as the weight of those words settled over them. The afternoon sun began sinking slowly toward the horizon, painting the rural sky a deep, burnt orange. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the backyard like dark claws reaching for the house. "He's already coming up the mountain road right now," the investigator finished with a final ugly laugh. "He'll be at this farm before nightfall, and he isn't coming to talk things out peacefully." Claire and Jack exchanged a look that held 1,000 unspoken words in that stifling old barn. The decision was made without needing to say a single word out loud. Running meant living the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. It meant letting fear dictate every step they took in the dark. Neither one of them was willing to be a victim of their own past ever again. Jack grabbed a dirty rag and gagged the investigator with quick, precise movements. He checked the ropes one final time, making sure the man couldn't work himself free. Then he took Claire's hand, and together they ran across the dusty yard toward the main house. The afternoon air felt heavy, hard to breathe. Every step kicked up small clouds of yellow dust that stuck to their sweat-damp skin. Reaching the front porch, Jack slammed the heavy oak door shut with a final, decisive thud. "They are not taking us out of this house," he said, his deep voice echoing through the dark hallway. Claire nodded, feeling a fierce new strength take root in her tired chest. They began dragging the heaviest furniture in the house to block every possible entrance. The big oak kitchen table was hauled over to brace the front door. The sound of wood scraping across the polished floor sounded like the roar of some wounded animal. Claire pushed with everything she had, ignoring the sharp sting in her open blisters. They stacked heavy sacks of flour and old chairs against the thin back door. Jack pulled a rusted toolbox out from under the main staircase and began nailing thick, rough planks over the glass windows of the living room. The steady hammering of nails driving into wood was deafening in the quiet countryside. Every strike was a declaration of war against the men coming to destroy their sanctuary. They finished sealing the ground floor just as the last ray of sunlight vanished behind the hills. The house sank into total darkness, lit only by the pale glow of the rising moon. The heat trapped inside was suffocating, but cracking open even a sliver would be a fatal mistake. Jack walked to the far end of the west hallway, toward the forbidden room that held his tragic past. He knelt in front of a built-in cabinet and pried up a loose floorboard. He pulled out a long case, wrapped in a thick blanket, that smelled of gun oil and mothballs. Claire followed in silence, watching as he unwrapped the bundle with steady, sure hands. It was an old, double-barreled shotgun, heavy, its wood worn smooth from years of use. Jack broke the barrel open and loaded 2 thick red shells. The metallic snap of the gun closing echoed through the narrow hallway like a death sentence. Claire hurried back to the kitchen, searching desperately for anything she could use to defend herself. She filled 2 enormous cast-iron pots with water and set them boiling hard over the fire in the wood stove. She also grabbed a long, sharp butcher's knife and a heavy iron poker used for stirring the embers. She laid her makeshift weapons out on the cold stone counter near the barricaded back door. Her heart pounded out of control, slamming against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. They met again in the middle of the dark living room, surrounded by barricades and long shadows. Jack sat on the floor, back against the wall, the shotgun resting across his knees. Claire slid down to sit beside him, seeking the comforting warmth of his body. He draped a heavy, protective arm over her thin shoulders, pulling her against his broad chest, letting her hear the steady, strong beat of his human heart. In that tight, silent embrace, they found all the strength they needed to face the longest night of their lives. "Whatever happens out there, don't leave my side," he whispered, kissing the top of her dark hair. She closed her eyes and nodded, breathing in the scent of clean earth and sweat coming off his old flannel shirt. The paralyzing fear had disappeared, completely replaced by a cold, unshakable resolve. The strongest bonds are often forged in the burning fire of extreme hardship and dark, difficult moments. The silence of the countryside was suddenly torn apart by the distant roar of several powerful engines closing in fast. The metallic sound cut through the quiet of the night like a knife through silk. Jack tensed immediately, lifting the heavy shotgun off his knees in one smooth, deadly motion. Claire crawled quickly to a small gap between two boards on the front window. The light from 3 sets of yellow headlights lit up the dusty road. The dark cars stopped hard in front of the wooden fence marking the edge of the lonely property. The car doors flew open, followed by the chilling sound of weapons being loaded in the darkness. 7 long, threatening shadows stepped out onto the dusty ground, moving with the precision of men well used to extreme violence. In the center of the group, lit by the headlights, stood the man Claire had fled months earlier. He wore an expensive suit that clashed grotesquely with the poor, rural setting of the old farm. His sharp face carried a contained fury and wounded pride that made him completely unpredictable and dangerous. He carried a thick cane in his right hand, striking the dry earth with impatience and blind rage. "Claire, I know perfectly well you're inside this miserable hole," the powerful man shouted, his voice cold and metallic. The echo of his words bounced off the wooden walls of the house, rattling what few unbroken window panes remained. "Come out the front door, and I promise I won't kill the poor fool who took you in." The young woman's stomach turned at the sound of that poisonous voice that had caused her so many nightmares. But she didn't move an inch from her position behind the reinforced wooden wall. Jack aimed the long barrel of the shotgun through a small gap in the barricade, tracking the silhouette of the lead invader. The powerful man made a sharp gesture with his gloved hand, and 3 of his hired men advanced toward the porch. They walked heavily, sidearms drawn, confident they were up against nothing more than a couple of frightened farmhands. They had no idea of the deep, dark fury living inside the heart of the big man waiting for them. Jack pulled the trigger of the hunting rifle without a moment's hesitation. The blast shook the whole structure of the old wooden house, filling the room with thick smoke and the smell of burnt gunpowder. The shot tore through one of the porch columns mere inches from the first attacker's head. The armed man screamed in terror and threw himself flat onto the splintered porch boards, covering his face with trembling hands. The other 2 scrambled back, taking cover behind the big stone water trough in the front yard. Jack's declaration of war had been clear, brutal, and absolutely deafening for everyone present. "Kill the damn farmer and bring me the girl alive!" the furious boss bellowed, ducking behind the open door of his luxury car. The order unleashed a storm of gunfire against the fragile wooden frame of the old house. Bullets slammed into the outer walls, shredding the peeling siding and splintering the dark window frames. Claire covered her head with her arms curled up on the floor as splinters of wood flew overhead. The noise was unbearable, like a storm of metal hail crashing straight down on top of them. Jack stayed low, reloading the shotgun with steady hands despite the rain of enemy bullets. He rose briefly and fired the second barrel toward the stone trough, sending sharp fragments flying through the hot air. One of the men choked back a cry of pain as a chunk of stone tore deep into his shoulder. The return fire intensified instantly, focusing dangerously on the main barricade in the living room. Suddenly, Claire heard a loud noise coming from the shadowed back of the house. Someone was hacking at the kitchen door with a heavy axe, trying to break through the thin wood and the stacked chairs. The enemy had circled the property during the chaos of the deafening gunfire out front. She pushed herself up off the floor, nearly crawling, and ran down the dark hallway toward the kitchen, lit only by the glow of the wood stove. The back door shuddered with every violent blow. The wood started to splinter dangerously down the middle. A huge hole opened near the iron bolt, and a hand in a dark leather glove reached through to work the lock. Claire didn't think about fear or the morality of her actions in that instant of pure survival. She grabbed one of the big cast-iron pots with both hands, protecting herself with thick, dirty dish towels. She lifted the heavy pot full of boiling water and threw it straight through the broken gap in the back door. The scream of agony that followed was so raw, it chilled the blood even of the men still firing out front. The attacker at the kitchen door dropped backward into the dust of the yard, writhing in pain from severe burns to his arm and face. Claire stumbled back, breathing hard, gripping the heavy iron poker tight in her blistered hands. She'd held her flank, but the main battle at the front of the house was about to reach a breaking point. The heavy oak table groaned and slid across the polished floor under a brutal outside force. 2 men were ramming the front door with a thick old log they'd found near the barn. Every hit shook the very foundation of the century-old house, knocking dust loose from the dark ceiling. Jack fired blindly through the gaps in the broken wood, trying to hold back the relentless advance. But the number of attackers was too great, and the farmer's ammunition was running out fast. With one final awful crack, the old iron hinges gave way, and the front door blew inward. The heavy oak table was shoved back violently, leaving the hallway completely exposed to the dark night. 3 men burst into the living room, kicking up thick clouds of dust, weapons raised and ready to kill. Jack didn't hesitate for a second. He swung the now empty shotgun like a deadly club at the first man through the door. The solid wooden stock cracked against the mercenary's jaw with a dull, sickening thud. The man dropped straight to the floor, losing both his weapon and consciousness on the spot. The second attacker aimed his black pistol directly at the farmer's broad, exposed chest. But before he could pull the trigger, a fast, small shadow leapt out of the darkness of the side hallway. It was Claire. Gripping the heavy iron poker with a strength born of pure, desperate love, she swung and struck the attacker's wrist with brutal force, shattering bone and forcing him to drop the gun to the floor. The man howled in pain and stumbled backward over the wreckage of the broken door. Jack used the distraction to charge the third invader, slamming him violently against the cracked wooden wall. The close-quarters fight became a chaos of shadows, blood, hoarse shouting, and splintered wood, filling the center of the room. Claire kicked the fallen gun out of everyone's reach and swung the poker at the injured man's knees. She fought like a cornered animal, protecting its own from much larger, far more dangerous predators. Silence fell suddenly over the ruined battlefield as the last attacker dropped unconscious onto the threadbare rug. Jack and Claire stood in the middle of the wrecked living room, breathing hard, covered in dust and shallow cuts. But the night of horror and violence still wasn't quite finished. An elegant, dark figure filled the frame of the completely shattered front doorway. It was the ruthless boss himself, gripping a shining silver pistol aimed straight at the wounded farmer's head. His sharp face was twisted with homicidal rage at seeing his professional mercenaries beaten by a farmer and a woman. "Game's over, farm boy," the powerful man hissed, cocking the weapon with a chilling metallic click. "You're going to die right here, and then I'm going to burn this house down with you in it before I take the girl." There wasn't a trace of mercy or hesitation in his empty eyes before committing cold-blooded murder. Jack instinctively stepped between the loaded gun and Claire's fragile body, offering his own chest as a final human shield. There was no fear in the farmer's dark eyes, only a calm acceptance of his own sacrifice for love. But the young woman flatly refused to be the cause of another death on that old farm. With a fast, fluid, unexpected motion, Claire threw the butcher's knife she'd kept hidden in the folds of her wide skirt. The heavy, sharp blade spun through the hot, thick air, driven by all the fury built up over months of persecution and abuse. The dark handle struck the boss's gun hand with startling force. The impact was sudden and painfully sharp. The wealthy man screamed, dropping the silver pistol, which clattered onto the splintered floorboards well out of reach. Before he could react or bend down to grab it, Jack's massive, unstoppable frame slammed straight into him. The farmer grabbed him by the collar of his expensive dark suit and lifted him several inches off the wooden floor, slamming him hard against the broken front door frame. The boss gasped for air desperately as the farmer's rough, powerful fingers closed around his pale, delicate throat. "Listen to me carefully, because I'll only say this once in my life," Jack growled, his face pressed close to the beaten man's own. "If you ever set foot on this land again, if you ever send anyone else to come looking for her, I swear on my dead son's memory, I will find you." His low, guttural voice carried a dark, deadly promise that no one in their right mind would dare test. Jack threw him aside like a dirty rag out of the ruined, bullet-scarred house. The powerful man dropped to his knees in the dry dirt, coughing, rubbing at his bruised, reddened throat. He looked back at the doorway and saw the two of them standing together shoulder to shoulder, looking like unbreakable giants silhouetted against the darkness. The head of the mercenaries ordered an immediate retreat with a pathetic, panicked wave of his hand to his injured men. The mercenaries dragged themselves back to the dark cars, fired up the engines, and sped away down the dusty road. The red taillights finally disappeared over the distant hills, swallowed by the healing vastness of the rural night. Deep silence settled back over the open countryside, broken only by the distant song of a few surviving cicadas. The old house stood, full of dark holes, broken doors, and splintered furniture scattered across the stained floor. But amid all that physical destruction, there was a deep, absolute peace that hadn't lived in that place for many, many years. Claire dropped the heavy iron poker and threw her arms around Jack with a desperate strength and endless gratitude. He buried his weathered face against her warm neck, letting out a trembling sigh that released years of pure, buried pain. The tears they shared together weren't tears of sadness. They were the water needed to wash the scorched earth clean and get it ready for a new planting season. The sun rose slowly over the clear horizon, bathing the wounded farm in a golden, clean, and completely purifying light. There were no more shadows of the past chasing their tired footsteps, and no more ghosts haunting the dark corners of that old wooden house. They had each other, now marked by pain, but ready to rebuild the walls and their lives, starting from the very foundation. Real love so often doesn't mean finding someone to live with in perfect, endless peace. It means finding the one person you're willing to fight for, bleed for, and defend every last piece of hard-won happiness for. It means taking the broken pieces of two tragic stories and joining them with endless patience into a fortress that nothing in the world can break.